This is my last of the post-election solo um, videos, and I wanted to talk a lot about some things I've been reflecting on. Um, I have noticed, anecdotally, that leftists are given the paroxysms of hope and despair, while liberals are tended to be given towards consolidating their view that defeating enemies, um, by that we mean Republicans, proves that their partisan basis is stronger than it is. Both make sense from a kind of folk psychological standpoint. The less power you actually have over the system, the more it makes sense to invest into a partisan and seemingly arbitrary identity in it. And then you will hear people talk of blue waves, even though we don't know who has won the House, and it seems highly unlikely it will be the Democrats. In most systems, not being able to affect a positive agenda is not considered an electoral victory, but so goes the constitutional reality of the United States. But the paroxysm of despair and hope are much deeper than this problem with Democrats. We've seen, and I get a lot of pushback when you actually point out, for example, that in a lot of the initial leftist campaigns, and I will use the political career of Swama Sawant, because on a video this upset a lot of people, well, actually one person, when I was vaguely critical of the amount of resources Socialist Alternative devotes into maintaining two small municipal level campaigns. Sawant is unlike a lot of people in the National Congress, has not been largely corrupted. There's no proof that she doesn't believe what she says. She votes seemingly on these issues. However, her last initiative victory on the Seattle City Council was really in 2015. Since then, the position has been defensive. So she got a $15 minimum wage pass through, and there was a Seattle high-end income tax, but other things that she had on her platform failed. And most of what her electoral victories are after that are defeating recalls and defeating attempts to chase her out of office, but not significant initiative victories. If one has principles, one is often stuck in a defensive position. And that is because, for a variety of reasons, a base for someone like Sawant to join up with, even with the DSA, has not really been on the table. You can be mad about that. You can be mad at me for telling you that. You can say that I'm not doing the work because I don't live in Seattle. I'm not willing to move to one of the most expensive parts of the country, do that work for you. Or that I'm just complaining. See, that's the funny thing that people like to point out when people tell you something they don't like, that you're complaining. And what are you doing? We used to have a word for this. After joining a couple of sectarian leftist organizations myself, I used to talk about what we called the Children's Crusade with Ezra KB, which was to get people highly invested in ideologically strong identities but with little clear means to success, and have them spend lots of their own personal labor and time um, before they've even had time to really cultivate their own skill sets to give self-sacrifice to some position that they have little means to do, and at the expense of cultivating things that would benefit their own life. Now, one of the ironies of this is you meet people who've done this well into their 40s and 50s, people who've been in sectarian organizations or activist leftists who've had very few successes on their docket, but continue to do it well into their 50s. To say this is cope is to even undermine coping. I also saw people start yelling about how America deserved what it got because of the election, even though the election ended up coming out in ways that favored them. The responses were immediate despair, because a lot of leftists have trained themselves to view the larger populations hostilely and to justify their paranoia with discussions of national deservedness or character. Now, there are national characters, all right? There's an aggregate in the way people act. There's no mass mind to the national character. It is the incentives in a nation's laws and culture that create different tendencies and incentivize certain personality traits to rise to the bottom of the top, right? That you can argue with me about that. There's nothing essential about it. You can change something in a national culture or a local culture in this change, but it does have to do with the intersection of economics, law, and history. All right, the way people in the United States talk about race comes from a history that is unique to Protestant versions of settler colonialism and development of a state that has very little history prior to what we might consider a capitalist modernity, etc. But to talk about deserve or not deserve is to conflate a national character, which is to say the way people are incentivized to act in a particular polity, usually a nation, with some kind of mass mind. See, one of the interesting things about national characters is people pushing back on them is also part of how they exist. It's not just that you're interpolated into them, it's that no, it isn't actually an incentive structure that works for everybody, and all these valves end up somewhere. And that all exists within a larger class and capital system, which is transnational and limits its ability, limits it. So, yes, we can talk about the difference in the way workers act between, say, South Korea, Mexico, and the United States, but we can't talk about fundamentally differences in the economic system and the way the profit motives work, because that is the same. When we talk about national character, it should not be on moral grounds. And by moral, we usually mean a motive. Now, I realize that separating emotion from reason is a totally false distinction. In your cognition, emotions are the way you pick between seemingly arbitrary inputs. Pure logic, in the absolute sense, are logics, because there's more than one, really, does not make any of those decisions for you. You would break down if you were trying to figure out if you wanted jam toast or peanut butter toast if you only had rational inputs, i.e., empirical data and logical arguments on how to make them. But this does not mean that you cannot discipline and cultivate your emotions. These paradoxical flights of hope and despair that you see with a lot of leftists need to be trained out of them. It is not that one needs optimism or pessimism, although I do talk about using a pessimistic view to shock people out of thinking that the status quo can be maintained forever, because it can't. And my arguments with Democrats who literally argued that partisanship and self-interest proved that party discipline wins the day, and I'm like, you didn't even win the House. You are pretending that a lack of a red wave is a blue wave. The self-deception rules the day because people have so much investment in these identities because they have little investment in anything else. You must cultivate things that temper your hope and despair. A little bit of cynicism is actually good because it means that you will not waste your time, sometimes decades of your spare time for some people, doing something that has no efficacy. And the way that you defend that is not to prove that you have efficacy, but it's to call other people not helping you part of the problem. I don't answer generally when people ask me what I do, even though I will tell them I'm a union rep. I do a lot more than that. I've done less of it since COVID, and that's why I do more streams, but I have done a lot, including things that could get you real dead. But that's not relevant. All right. Who I am when I say these things to you is only a heuristic of why you should maybe give me a little bit of credibility. But the truth of what I say is not based on my credibility. All that gets you is whether or not you should get it in the door. See, the argument I made about national character is something I take from sociology and actually from German conservative revolutionaries. They aren't totally wrong. German conservative revolutionaries also, as I was talking to a friend who said I misrepresented them on a podcast recently, criticize fascists for encouraging propaganda to the point that it would make the nation unable to think. Now, I think, again, national minds, not a great idea, but I do see a fundamental truth. And if you push propaganda or you push hope or you push bad narratives, you will incentivize people not to think, not to cultivate and discipline their emotions. See, when I talk about thinking, I don't think there's a binary between feeling and thinking, but I do think you have to cultivate your emotions. See, when I don't control my emotions, I am kind of a hard person to deal with. But this has also got to be true in other areas of your life. You have to learn to control your hope and despair. You're not going to not feel it. You're not going to reason it away, but you can discipline it. You can channel it and you can use external inputs against it, just like with your anger or anything else. You should not be making decisions based off your immediate intuitions alone. Your intuitions help you, they guide you, they're useful, but they will also lead you to feeling like the Democrats not losing is proof of a left agenda, or that the Democrats won the workers, and statements that are not even wrong, they're almost meaningless. But it makes us feel good about our investments. And even if it's not long-term effective, none of these people are able to affect a positive agenda right now. They're just able to stop a positive agenda. That's not a victory. And you can't run a society off that long term. And people project onto their victories, which however marginal they are, that they have more support and more people think like them than do. And that's true for all political varieties. People self-segregate. It's not just social media bubbles. You have to cultivate a mindset that allows you to both empathize with another person without identifying with them, to understand what makes certain groups tick, to have heuristics of how to operate within them, but also how to change your message for them and move between them. Talk about justice or these other things are vague. And people emotionally feel a lot, they feel attached to them, so they might be rhetorically useful. But as actual ways to activate, get people to do policy, get people to build a quote fairer world, or what I would say a more power egalitarian world, which is not a phrase I would use with the general public because it sounds weird. One of the weird ironies of our day is that people realize the Democratic partisan identity, even probably more than Republican partisan identity, is an empty suit. It means a lot of different things. And so a lot of people try to have their cake and eat it too, but posit that they aren't Democrats, that they're Democratic Socialist or something else, while also effectively acting as partisans. But not that only works off of negative partisanship and projection. And the projections break down when you can't do anything. That's the irony of the situation. The Democrats. Do you think they're going to fix Roe v. Wade at the national level? They can't if they lose the House. They're not willing to get rid of the filibuster. They want to play by the rules right now, although they might not in the future. And we can be mad about that. But as soon as we see what happens in Florida, we will go in the opposite direction, and we're being a large part of the population. But it does nothing about the quote hydrocarbon cartels. It does nothing about our serious economic problems and projecting elsewhere, putting your hope in some other country or some other proletariat or whatever because your politics seems frustrated is also a cope. And it's something that has limited the ability of leftists to do much of anything for the last 50, 60 years. You know, internationalism means building bridges. It doesn't mean projecting all your fantasies upon somewhere else. It's time that a lot of us learn to discipline and cultivate and not just signal to ourselves. We often signal only to our own identities. We prove that we're leftists to other leftists or that we're Democrats to other Democrats by talking the right things or doing the right things or caring about the right things. Right? We signal. We do virtue signal. I know that right wingers throw it at us, and I know that we're often right to say that they're just vice signaling, that they're doing negative virtue signaling. That's all completely true, but it doesn't change what we're doing. You want to fix the homeless problem? You need social housing. You need better integration of people with mental with mental disabilities into society. You need to deal with public use of intoxicants. You need to limit acceptable behavior. And I don't mean legally, I mean socially too. Like, I believe in freedom. I think most substances should be legalized. But I also think that we probably should get very, 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 very high people into a place where they are safe and not out into the street to interact with everybody. Now, I realize that the primary threat to everyone is domestic violence. But pretending that it's one and not the other, because one narrative fits one lefty frame and another narrative fits a right wing frame, is not how most people operate. It's just how most highly partisan people operate. Furthermore, I do think we have to have some pretenses towards universalism amongst people who are not owners of massive amounts of capital. As long as you put people outside of your struggle or make it all about altruism, you're losing. And if you fear everyone, even if you fear everyone rightfully, okay, there's good reasons for that. A lot of the responses to that, the safety response, leads to secluding yourself, leads to people not knowing who you are, leads to a likelihood of continued abuse. Appealing to people in the most basic common prior language is going to be useful for everyone in building a bridge. And there's going to be some people you have to exclude because they are anti-universalist. But you have to believe that everyone's skin is in the game, that your autonomy is really going to, and I don't just mean believe this, I mean interact with it too, that your autonomy, that everyone's autonomy should be treated the same, because otherwise you're going to have specific systems and it's going to fall on specific kinds of marginalized people first. And it is also in our class interest to do so. So pretending that these are just special interests is too simple. But also demanding that everyone ascends to the understanding of our culture means that our culture, whatever that is, will, as a subculture within larger society, will be alienated. And then demanding that people respect that separately from their own interest is asking for them to be altruistic. And I just don't think that's usually the way most people work. Talks about justice or who can talk about what or this and that need to be built on building as many bridges as possible. And you can say, well, you're an outsider, you're not it's not your right to judge. And I'm like, well, I'm not judging. I am an outsider on many of these issues. We all are outsiders in certain issues. Everyone is outside to something. The idea that you don't have any incentive to be inclusive because of threats to you means that those threats will grow. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus. But that's why all our emotive appeals and everything needs to be honed and disciplined. And many of you, a lot of you, are more interested in hope or despair, because that's what you immediately feel. And in the light of overwhelming complexity and odds, that makes absolute sense. But that's the exact reason why you must temper and discipline that. Don't let the Overton window move you. You need to find what you need to be able to move in the world. You need to discipline that. It is on you as an individual as well as us collectively. I once said that if you really believe in a leftist project, you realize how hard it is for people to self-improve. But also, the converse of that is that we have to demand that we're all better. Not just collectively, not just that the government fixes things for us. Not this, that the class comes together. We have to make ourselves and other people better than we are. And we have to decide what better means. Discipline yourselves. Because I promise you, despite defeating Trump, that we didn't win as much as a lot of people are thinking. And the people who think they can throw their hats in with this current situation, these empty Democratic suits, are going to have a hard time in the long run, because the problems are coming faster and faster and faster. And if you can't see that, you're dipping your head in the sand. The enemy is not just the political opponents, it's the entire terrain. Discipline yourselves. Good night.
تبدو آثاره انفجار ثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.